Hi, online people. We will begin momentarily. Thank you for your patience.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. This feels sort of like one of my classrooms on a Friday during the beautiful spring. But I do appreciate all of you here. I appreciate those of you who are attending virtually. Welcome to our session, which is entitled Students' Reuse of Their Own Writing Across Courses, Instructional Attitudes, Ethical Considerations, and Practical Strategies. Just to very briefly introduce the panelists, I'm Michael Pemberton from Georgia Southern University. My colleagues here are Chris Ensign from North Carolina State University and Suzanne Hall from the California Institute of Technology. We've been working on a project for, I think, upwards of 6 to 7 years now. And as we draw close to the end of the project, we're going to be giving you a report on partly what we've done, but also looking more specifically and focusing on some of the more recent work that we're doing that's related to education. We want to start with the land acknowledgement. This comes from the Clemson University Writing Lab. We acknowledge that the main campus of Clemson University occupies the traditional and ancestral land of the Cherokee people. Clemson's main campus is built on land seized through U.S. military and diplomatic incursions, culminating in the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner in 1777. This is also land on which people enslaved by the Pickens, Clemson, and Calhoun families lived and worked, and that was transformed into the campus of Clemson University through convict labor. We make this acknowledgement to remember the histories of violence that anticipate our gathering here, to recognize Indigenous and Black claims to life and land, and to recenter those claims as we commit to better ways of caring for each other and for this land. This is a brief outline of the presentation. I'm going to be giving you, talking a lot at you at the beginning to give you an introduction to the text recycling research project, if you're not already familiar with it, as well as the taxonomy that we use to talk about text recycling types. Chris will then talk about instructional attitudes towards text recycling in a classroom context based on a study that he has recently conducted. And then Suzanne will discuss a model text recycling policy for classroom contexts. And with any luck, we will have time for question and answer and discussion. And in the notion, sort of in keeping with our principles that we develop when we develop policy for text recycling, we have a statement here that says, some language and images in this presentation have been used in prior presentations on this topic to different audiences. And as you'll see when we talk about some of the policies we have developed, transparency is a key to a lot of the policy recommendations that we make. So the Text Recycling Research Project is in fact supported by a grant from the National Science Foundation under the category of Cultivating Cultures for Ethical STEM. So keep in mind, at least in the back of your mind, that this is a research study that is focused primarily, although not exclusively, on the STEM disciplines, but there are certainly resonances with other areas of study and disciplines as well. We also encourage you to visit our website, which is textrecycling.org. I'm going to be giving you a very brief overview of all of the research and publications and studies we've done over 6 years, and I will obviously be doing so in a very brief fashion. So if you want to dig deeper into this, we certainly encourage you to visit the website. The lead PI for this study is Carrie Moskowitz, who cannot be here with us today at Duke University, who runs the Thompson Writing Program. Co-PI is here. The only one who is not here as a co-PI is Ian Anson, who is the progeny of Chris, who is at, what is that, University of Minnesota? Maryland, Baltimore County. Thank you very much. And other contributors as well. I'm not going to read through all of these people, but this is our advisory board. Since this is a set of policies we were trying to promote across a wide variety of disciplines, we wanted to make sure that we were consulting with people who were very knowledgeable about research integrity, about ethics and ethics in publication. So we have people who are representing the Council of Science Editors, the Committee on Publication Ethics, Taylor and Francis, the American Chemical Society, quite a wide and broad and diverse set of advisors who were extraordinarily helpful to us as we conducted our studies and developed policies. So the initial project goals for the text recycling research project were threefold. We wanted to undertake a large-scale investigation of text recycling, and I will get to a definition of that shortly, in research writing, particularly these areas. First of all, beliefs and attitudes. If we were interested in talking about text recycling, we wanted to know exactly how gatekeepers and others in the disciplines felt about text recycling and its ethical appropriateness or inappropriateness. Text analysis, where we were investigating exactly how frequently and in what quantities and in what locations text recycling took place in scientific publications, as well as legal analysis to look and see whether or not there were, in fact, current cases, legal and otherwise, as well as in contract law, to discover sort of rules and guidelines that were in place about the practice of text recycling. Our ultimate goal was to create research-based guidelines and policies on text recycling for publishers, authors, instructors, and what we're going to be talking about today, students. Here's the definition of text recycling that has been under development, and I think this is pretty close to our finalized form. Text recycling is the reuse of textual material, prose, visuals, or equations in a new document where one, the material in the new document is identical to that of the source or substantively equivalent in both form and content. Two, the material is not presented in the new document as a quotation via quotation marks or block indentation. And three, at least one author of the new document is also an author of the prior document. And if you want to read a more detailed discussion of sort of how we came up with this term and some of the nuances and contingencies that we were thinking about as we developed this, you're welcome to visit this page on our website. The overview of TRRP research, we actually got started in 2015, looking at beliefs and attitudes or perspectives. We did a survey. We started out with a survey of editors and editorial board members. We tried to make sure that this survey was represented demographically by a wide variety of disciplines within STEM, and that there were relatively equivalent numbers of people who were being surveyed about their attitudes. One of the findings that we had was, in fact, that about 80% of the gatekeepers that were surveyed did think that text recycling was a valid writing practice, at least in some specific contexts. However, we also have to note that there was little consensus. There was a very wide range of opinions that were expressed in these surveys. The survey asked people to respond to a variety of questions and hypothetical scenarios, as well as providing some space for them to give open-ended responses and explain some of their answers. There were people who were hardliners who said, absolutely no way would I ever allow any author in my journal to do any kind of recycling from anything that they had previously published before. And there were also editors and others who said, why not? Okay. And we'll get into that a little bit more deeply later. In the interviews that we had with editors, the names of the editors we interviewed were derived, at least in part, from a question that we had on the survey, asking them if they were in fact willing to be interviewed to get more in-depth responses and explanations for some of the responses to the survey questions that they gave. We then interviewed or took a look at novice and expert perspectives to see whether or not there were people who were students, novice writers, beginning graduate students, who had perhaps different perspectives on text recycling as those who had been in the field, in the disciplines, publishing articles for a number of years. The second part of the study was to take a look at how frequently and where text recycling actually took place. There are a lot of people who hear the term text recycling, and I should probably point out that we chose that phrase deliberately in opposition to a phrase which was often and very commonly used, which is self-plagiarism, which has a lot of pejorative and very negative implications. And as we looked into this more and more, we began to realize that we wanted to promote the notion that it's not the same thing as plagiarism. And in fact, as we discover, it's actually a fairly common practice among a lot of people who are writing in a variety of disciplines. So to understand exactly how frequently this took place, how common it was, we engaged in a corpus analysis. We did a computerized search for text recycling across multiple publications in the same NSF grant. So what this did was we looked at NSF grants, tried to identify those that had at least 5 publications over a period of time. And then Chris and Ian were primarily responsible for developing an algorithm and a process for analyzing these texts in order to identify when and where recycled text had appeared from one study to the next in that sequence chain. And one of the things that we found out, just very briefly, was a lot of people are doing it a lot of the time and probably a lot more often than you would expect it to occur. Okay. Another thing that they found is that the place where that kind of text recycling normally took place tended to be primarily, although certainly not exclusively, in things like method sections and literature reviews. Okay, so widespread across disciplines, no clear evidence that it's practiced more often in particular fields. So computer scientists were as likely to do it as civil engineers, for example. We then took a look at publishing contracts to study some of the legalities. One of the things that we discovered was that apparently there had never been a case, an actual legal case, in which a writer had been sued for recycling text or a publisher had been sued for recycling printed recycled text from one publication to another. However, there are certain legalities that sometimes appear in publishing contracts that preclude authors from being able to reuse more than just a small amount of the text that they had originally published. There is, however, a wide variation in what TR practices are explicitly or implicitly allowed or restricted. And even internally, in the same document sometimes, in publishing contracts, there are contradictions within them about what their policies are towards text recycling. So one of the consequences of this initial research, and again, if you go to our website, you can see the published articles in full to get a more detailed explanation of the processes. We developed policy guidelines for researchers and publishers based on the research, as well as a taxonomy for distinguishing different types of text recycling. And this was key, because when you hear the term self-plagiarism or text recycling, that covers a huge and very broad domain of possible instances, contexts, and amounts. So we thought it was important to try to make very clear distinctions among different types of text recycling, because those also have very clear implications for what's considered ethical and unethical. So very quickly, here was our taxonomy of text recycling types. We did this in order to better understand the practices, as well as to establish a clear and consistent framework for articulating ethical practices and making recommended policies for larger organizations and publishing groups. So the first kind of text recycling that we distinguish is what we call developmental recycling. Developmental recycling is the reuse of material from what are commonly considered to be unpublished documents. And as you might imagine, the term unpublished was sometimes contentious, because different editors, different disciplines will sometimes have very different perspectives on what's considered a publication. So an example of developmental recycling is the reuse of material from unpublished documents, such as language from a conference talk that's then used in a dissertation, or language from a poster presentation, such as those we have here, that are later used in a research article. There are some editors, very few fortunately, but at least a few, who thought that posters that were presented at a conference counted as a publication, and therefore presented different kinds of ethical challenges if they wanted to reuse that language. Here's a chart that I'm going to be referring to very quickly as we go through this. We developed this as a kind of a flow chart so that people could ask questions about sort of the kind of text recycling that they're doing and the extent to which it might be ethical or unethical. So developmental recycling is what we sometimes think about as presenting a work in progress. So it's not something that is considered to be an official publication, but it's an opportunity to share information in a forum that either has a relatively small audience or with a specific rhetorical purpose for soliciting feedback, getting advice, and leading ultimately to revision that could become a more formal publication. Is this ethical? Yeah, usually it is. And is it legal? Yeah, it's usually legal to do so. Some of the restrictions might be if, for example, a piece is done as a work for hire, where somebody else is actually from the very beginning claiming ownership of this work, then there might be some considerations about whether or not it's either ethical or legal to use that text for other purposes when technically somebody owns that intellectual property. Okay. Second category is what we call generative recycling. This is probably the most common kind of recycling that takes place in academic publishing. This is the reuse of portions of a previously published document in a new work that makes an original intellectual contribution clearly distinct from the source. Examples might be language describing the methods or instruments or research location in one published article and reused in the subsequent article. Second would be language describing a key research question that's relevant across a body of research that is then reused in multiple published articles. One of the interesting arguments that we came across, or that we heard from a number of editors and editorial board members about this, is that it seems perfectly agreeable and acceptable for an author or authors to recycle text related to methodology from one article to the next, because the issue of replicability is extremely important. And asking an author to rewrite or rephrase the way that they had performed a particular experiment or to describe the equipment that they used could oftentimes lead to challenges with comprehension and consistency. And they thought that in those cases, recycling text in method section actually presented a certain kind of contribution to the scientific discourse, especially if people are following a series of articles about the same topic. Okay. So again, as we say here, is it ethical conditionally? And is it legal conditionally? So in terms of ethics, one of the questions that we wrangled with a lot had to do with the circumstance in which a lot of research is conducted using extremely large research teams. And one article in a research sequence might be written by a slightly different collection of authors than appear in subsequent articles. So where you might have 3 authors on the first article, 2 of those authors might appear in the next article, but the third one does not, and there might be another third or fourth. So the question then becomes, is it ethical and legal for the people who are writing this new article to recycle text from a previous article when the 2 author groups do not overlap 100%? And if they don't, what do you do in a situation like that? Legality, again, there are some cases of publishing contracts that set limitations or restrictions on recycling. The third kind of recycling that we identify is what we call adaptive publication. This is one in which there's republication of an entire document or of its central parts, but it's modified to fit a different context, such as a different audience or a different discipline. This new context may, for example, be different in the target audience or language or expertise or genre. So it's literally taking the same information, the same study, talking about the same process, methods, and results, but you craft it in a way that sort of fits the needs of a very different audience. So an article aimed at one discipline is reworked into a commentary aimed at a different discipline at the invitation of an editor, or an English language article aimed at a US audience is translated and published for a Chinese audience. Okay. Is it ethical? Again, conditionally, under some circumstances. Is it legal? Maybe, maybe not. The ethicality might require, for example, a clear statement or citation of where the original publication took place. And the legalities, obviously, you would have to deal with permissions and transparency with all of the stakeholders in both publications. Okay? Otherwise, it might be unethical and illegal. The last one is probably the one that you're most might think of first, which is duplicate publication, which is the publishing of a work that's the same in genre, content, and intended audience as a previously published source document. An example might be an article that's published for one journal that is lightly revised and resubmitted for publication at another journal. And you can probably guess by the fact that we have it in red here on our little flow chart, This is the big red flag. It's the big stop sign. It's the big no-go. It's rarely ethical and it's rarely legal. The only circumstance I can think of, just like off the top of my head, where it would be okay is if you have a collection in which you are literally reprinting articles in an anthology or in a textbook. But even in those cases, you have very clear attribution and citation that takes place. But doing it without that would very likely be, if not certainly be, unethical and illegal. So as I transition to my colleague, Dr. Anson here, we're going to take a look at some of the differences between the professional and academic publishing contexts in which the vast majority of our research study was focused. We thought it was important also to talk about the ways in which text recycling might be either similar to or extraordinarily different from the kinds of contexts and contingencies we think about in academic publishing as opposed to the classroom.
Okay, thanks, Michael. We got off to a bit of a late start, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through this. So the first thing we wanted to do in this research was to compare instructors' attitudes towards student text recycling with what we found in the first phases of the study among scholars and editors. And then also beyond that, to think about what kinds of interpretive lenses teachers, instructors use when they think about text recycling among their students. So we created an international survey. This was an IRB approved survey that I designed, a Qualtrics survey, and it was sent to 8 listservs and Facebook groups of higher education instructors. We have more than 224 full responses now, and it's open. That tiny URL there, you can go to the survey to see it, and I would urge you to do it. 3E6YYPAR. We can put this back up later if you'd like to. You don't have a minute here to jot that down. So we're going to be talking about 224 full responses. The survey included some demographic questions, how long have you been teaching, et cetera. A question about the general acceptability of text recycling by students, is that okay or not? And then there are 5 instructional scenarios. You've got those floating around there as handouts. With open-ended boxes for open-ended comments and explanations. I have a large print here version in case anybody needs that. Just raise your hand if you need a large print version. You can also get to the handout through this QR code. It's also in the box repository. So the 5 scenarios that these respondents considered were these. The first involves a student in the history course. None of the instructors in any of these scenarios knew that the students were doing the text recycling. The first involved a student in a history course who takes another history course. Both of the courses had a component of a focus on World War II. The student recycles the entire paper, puts a different title on it and date. Without letting the instructor know. The second scenario involves a thermal fluids course in which the students are assigned to do a bench experiment. The student does the experiment, gets the results, writes up the lab report, gets an above average grade on the lab report, but fails the course for other reasons. Re-enrolls in the course the next semester with a different instructor who assigns the same bench experiment. The student does the experiment, gets slightly different results, recycles the original lab report with the slightly different results inserted. The third scenario involves a student in a literature course who focuses on a story called Through the Tunnel by Doris Lessing. It's a sort of a coming of age story about a young boy with his mother on the Mediterranean on vacation, and he wants to swim through this underwater tunnel that these older boys are doing. It's actually a terrifying story because he doesn't know, he gets kind of stuck in the middle of it. But there are 2 paragraphs in this paper that the student writes focusing on the boys noticing features of his mother's naked arm. In a subsequent course on transatlantic authors, the student chooses Doris Lessing, chooses the same story, writes a totally different paper focusing more broadly on the role of bodies in the story, takes the 2 paragraphs about the naked arm and recycles those verbatim into the new paper. The fourth scenario involves a student who does an annotated bibliography in a political science course on EU immigration policies. in a subsequent course, writes a paper on EU immigration policies and recycles some of the annotated bibliography in the introduction and lit review of the paper. The final scenario involves a student in a sociolinguistics course who does an oral presentation on the dialect on Tangier Island and the Chesapeake Bay. And then in the subsequent sociolinguistics course is asked to do a secondary research paper on a particular dialect. He chooses the Tangier Island dialect and recycles material from the scripted oral presentation that he'd done in the first course. So these are the results. First of all, there were 22 other countries, people from other countries who responded to the scenario in addition to the US. Many European, also Israel, Australia, Mexico, South Africa, etc. There were no significant relationships between the country of residence and any of the responses. There was a demographic question about how long you've been teaching. The majority of teachers have been teaching 11 or more years, but there was no significant relationship between years teaching and any of the responses. And then finally, there was no significant relationship between academic discipline. Those were reported in generalized disciplinary areas like social sciences, STEM, et cetera, and the responses. There was one statistically significant relationship between the level of teaching, mostly undergraduate, mostly graduate, or a mix of the two. And here you can see that among the nevers, I would never accept text recycling by students. We have, among those who said never, 14.7% said we're teaching primarily undergraduates, and 23.5% were teaching primarily graduates. And that's an interesting finding because, as you've heard from Michael, when we move up into the professions, we find text recycling happens pretty often. And yet, in this case, the teachers are clamping down more often on graduate students than they are undergraduates. We can speculate about that later. This is the general acceptance of student TR, and you can see that the vast majority were contingent. It depends, but there were some, around almost 40, who said, I would never accept this under any circumstances, and then a smaller number saying, I would accept any text recycling under any circumstances. And these are some of the explanations. I teach my students it's self-plagiarism. You have to, it's about credits. When you earn credits for a course, you gotta, you've got to do the work. You can't repeat it. Once a paper's been turned in, I view that as a sort of publication, and you can't republish work. Among the always, it's their work and they choose how to use it. If the TR is applicable to the audience, purpose, and assignment, then the student should be able to TR. It's their individual work to be used and reused. It's all about ownership, right? I call it good academic planning. Recycle is perfect analogy. It's recycling the rhetoric. And then the possibilities, well, when papers build on previous ones, there's often an overlap of subjects. So it's okay to use that in another essay. They've written on a topic before. I'm comfortable with them building on that previous project, building on. But we need a conversation about it. Or if it's going to lead to a dissertation or a thesis, I'm okay with the TR. These are the consolidated scenario results. So you see that overwhelmingly, the respondents said for scenario number one, no way, I'm not going to accept the complete paper being recycled. But there were 16 who said, the greens are okay and the blues are depends. And then the others are, the lab report is sort of mixed. We'll come back to that briefly in a second, but they were almost evenly spread out there. And then the last three, the two paragraphs, the bibliographic references and the oral presentation, you can see that there are far more respondents who said they would accept those cases. But obviously quite a few who also would not. Now, the other handout that's floating around are the codes. And what I did was constant comparison of the open-ended data, hours and hours of working through, looking at it again. That yielded a set of open codes. Those were refined, and they developed into a set of axial codes that I could then apply and deduce to all the data. And then some selective recoding yielded a pretty good reliability index of 0.87. Again, here's the QR. It's the same one as the one before, but you can find it there or on the handout. So let me briefly go through the codes. They're explained in much more detail in the handout. These are the things that predominantly people said. These are the lenses that they use to look through at these cases of student text recycling. How much text is recycled? What are the learning goals of the assignment? Then just a general one about this is cheating, this is dishonesty, this is plagiarism. Whether the student received course or institutional credit, that fell both ways. The genre, was it a different genre requiring different kinds of writing processes? Learning or building on knowledge, getting permission from the teacher or consulting with the teacher, whether it happens in professional practice, general rules of the course or the institution, self-citation, a lot of depends. If the student cited their own work, I'd be okay with it. Student agency and ownership, whether it's published or not. Then a very, very small number of people since post-COVID said, you know what, students are really in bad shape. And so this is about their health. I'm okay with it. I'm okay with this because they're struggling. So this is the total number of codes for all the scenarios. And you can see here that they vary quite a bit. The health one is very, very small. The good news here is that the codes that were most often discovered in the open-ended data referred to whether the student was learning anew in the second iteration. So that seems to be the primary concern of teachers, is if the student's learning something new, then I'm okay with some form of text recycling, and also permission. If the student consults with me and talks to me about what they're doing, then I might feel differently about this. The others are sort of more evenly spread out. There was a little bit more for genre. So this is the code application across the 5 scenarios. And you can see here that the reds are no's, the greens are yes, the blues are maybe, but you can see that the learning or building on for that whole paper, that was the most often cited reason for not accepting that. The student's not learning or building on. Or also you can see a pretty high number saying it's just cheating, it's plagiarism. Student agency or ownership, we're going to see that green there across the 5 scenarios, that anybody who believes that the student owns their work and they can do what they want with it is often going to mention that. The lab report, and this is interesting, the institutional credit came up most often among those who would accept the recycling of the lab report because the student did not earn credit for the course. So they should be able to reuse that lab report. They did the experiment again. There's not a whole lot of new learning, but we don't see that as a very, very high threshold for determining yes or no. Permission, disclosure, consultation, pretty high for the no's. If the student had done that, I would have accepted it. It's cheating, it's dishonesty, it's plagiarism, and so forth. The 2 paragraphs in the literature paper, in this case, many of those who would tolerate that explained that the student is making a new paper. It's the same author, but they're rethinking everything. They're focusing more broadly on bodies. It's okay to take those 2 paragraphs. And interestingly, the amount of text was very low. It was like, that's not a big consideration. I would have thought that would be much higher among those who were saying yes, that they say, yeah, it's 2 paragraphs, come on, in a whole paper. And then the rest of those codes are pretty evenly distributed. We keep seeing the same dishonesty, plagiarism. That's sort of a trigger for any of these cases. The bibliography that goes into the lit review of the paper, you can see again, it's learning or building on. Students writing a different paper. There's some who said, again, cheating, dishonesty, plagiarism. Student agency ownership, same thing there, for those who think that it's their own work. And then the genre or nature of either or both texts. Because the genre is different, we see quite a few greens and blues there. The people are saying, well, it's a different genre, so the student's writing differently than they did the first time. The last one, the oral presentation of the written paper, we see again, learning or building on. I would have thought here that we'd see more about professional practice. There were some greens, some people who tolerate that, who said, hey, we could write this up if we wanted to. This is what professionals do. We give oral presentations and we write them up as articles. And so they referred to that. Again, the rest of these are fairly predictable: cheating, dishonesty, or student agency or ownership. So conclusion, we've got a continuum of attitudes. That first question is confirmed. It looks very similar to the the professional side of our work here. We have hardliners. Interestingly, most of those who found the 2-paragraph TR unacceptable found all the cases unacceptable. On the other end, we have the permissives. Most of those who found the whole paper TR acceptable found all the cases acceptable. And then in the middle, we have a lot of contextualists who chose different responses, gave different explanations and reasons, depending upon the circumstances and the context. So before I turn it over to Suzanne, the similarities here we're seeing and differences between writing for publication and coursework. First of all, gatekeepers may want to prohibit use entirely. We're going to argue against that, as you heard from Michael. I mean, there's circumstances where we think this is perfectly fine and cases in which it's perfectly fine. It's context dependent, clearly, and transparency is the key to ethical reuse. Lots and lots of people saying, hey, if the student talks to me about this, I might accept it. It might be fine, but I need to consult with them to see what they're learning, et cetera. The key differences are that research writing is primarily geared toward readers. We hope and care about the fact that researchers are building on their own previous knowledge, but it's not a big deal for us. The big deal is what we're getting from their research. That's not the case with the coursework. Here, the teachers obviously seem very preoccupied with whether the student is learning something. It's not the case with the professional practice. So those are some of the key differences we see between the two settings. So, yeah.
All right, so as Chris was just explaining, we'd done this prior research, a lot of work, not just publishing the research, but a lot of our focus was on making recommendations. We didn't just want to document what practices were. We wanted to give publishers the tools to actually change these practices to promote scholarly communication, which is ultimately what we're all in this for. But as we were thinking about what we could do for the classroom context, it was clear this big difference in the purpose of writing inside a classroom as opposed to writing for publication meant that we needed a new resource for this context. So this QR code points you toward the resource we have created that's now available on our website. So if you're having trouble with a QR code or the hyperlink, you can just Google text recycling, TRRP, our website comes up, go to resources, and it should be there. For those who are in the room, it's also the other handout that you have. And if you don't happen to be sitting near one, there's some up here in the front if you want to grab one. I'm going to spend the next few minutes talking through this resource in hopes that you will find it useful. So we wanted to make sure that administrators, instructors, and students would be aware that students' reuse of their own writing is not inherently unethical. And one of the things we'd found in talking with publishers was there was hesitation even among, and I should not publishers so much as editors of journals, felt like, oh, I think X and Y kind of recycling is fine, but I can't let people do it. It's not right, or some people won't think it's right. So there was this risk aversion and these kind of under-interrogated assumptions that people had of like, well, it's called self-plagiarism, so it must be bad. And that's where I stopped thinking about it. So we want a resource to get people thinking, not to say, oh, well, you should always allow it. That's not our opinion either, but to get people reflecting on this a little bit more. We wanted to offer a concise policy on course-based reuse that we thought a wide variety of colleges and universities could potentially adopt. And then we wanted to give kind of limited, but some resources to faculty to support them both developing local policies for their courses that would make sense, and to try to discourage some of the teaching practices that can put students in a position where they might feel like they have no alternative to text recycling. And we want to nudge faculty away from that. So if you look on the first page, you see in that box, this is our institutional policy that we're hoping to offer universities and colleges at the top level to take up. And I'll actually take the time to read this. Student reuse of their own prior work can promote learning in some contexts and inhibit it in others. Because contexts differ in this regard, students are expected to adhere to the following policy on reuse. Students cannot reuse material from another course, whether at this degree, granting educational institution or another, including high school, without their current instructor's explicit permission. If that permission is not explicitly granted in the course syllabus or assignment requirements, students must get written permission in advance. if the student had one or more co-authors on the original or source document, they're not allowed to recycle from that document unless the instructor explicitly agrees to an exception. So, and the reason we decided to have this idea of asking for written permission instead of just talking after class to an instructor is just, if you've ever been involved in academic honesty cases, you don't want to get into a misunderstanding. Oh, the instructor said, I thought you said this. Oh, I thought you said this. It's like, let's have an email where we can see the instructor said you could do X and then you did Y. So this is the policy, very simple, nothing like that's probably blowing your mind about this, but making sure that institutions have a policy, that we move that term self-plagiarism out of the policy. Those are our goals. Also in this handout, we've put in 5 class context scenarios. Those are the bullet points on the second page. You'll recognize some of these as being related to the more robust and detailed scenarios from Chris's study, but we wanted to include these and not to say, okay, here's the right answer to this, but to get administrators or faculty, especially who might be those more hardliners or who are just in their own disciplinary silos, as many of them are, to think about, oh, you know, I never assigned something like this, but I can see how a colleague might actually allow recycling in this other context. So that the rhetorical purpose there is not to say, to decide about any of the rightness or wrongness. It's always going to be contextual, but to open the readers' minds of the handout to think about. There probably are some scenarios where students reusing their own work makes a lot of sense and actually supports their learning. We also included a sample syllabus statement. Again, many of you have done this kind of work before where you just want to make it as easy as possible for faculty to build this into their own course documents. So here we're encouraging them to put an institutional policy in, and then we gave these options. Again, there's nothing magical or definitive about this, but it's just a good starting place. So students in this course who wish to reuse their own prior writing should follow this guidance. If you wish to resubmit the entirety of a written document produced in a different course with minor modifications, you should email me your prior document and explain why resubmission is justified. If you wish to recycle portions of a prior document produced in a different course and producing a new document for this course, write me an email that includes the source with the material you intend to reuse highlighted, describe where it came from, explain how this new use differs from the prior document. If the ways in which you're reusing the prior material changes as the project develops, you should email me again to discuss this. So we wanted to give folks here a little bit of time to talk with one another, because we've found in doing this work, it can be quickly transformational to just have conversations with other people about their opinions or experiences or practices to surface your own assumptions. Of course, this is a group of people who are quite thoughtful about everything we're touching on here, but we thought a chance to just talk about a few of these questions, and then we'll come back as a group for Q&A and also sharing out from this. So you can take up any one of these questions that interests the folks that you end up getting together with. Does your university have a policy regarding text recycling, or self-plagiarism, it might more likely be called? Do you address text recycling in your own course materials? In your WAC-WID work, have you talked with colleagues across the disciplines about text recycling in their teaching? Do you think there are different disciplinary norms for classroom recycling? Chris didn't find that correlation, but do you think there might be? What would the roots be? And what are your responses to the scenarios in either of the handouts that we gave you today? I'd encourage you to get together. I think the configuration of this room, probably just 2 to 3 people, but with people not from your local institution, so that you can talk to people with different contexts there. Jess, and if you can help the folks online go into breakout rooms, let's just take maybe 7 or 8 minutes on this, and then we'll come back together for Q&A. Thank you. Yep.
So. Yeah, me too.
Whenever you're ready to come back here, all you have to do is click close all rooms.
Okay. Is it touch screen or is it?
Either one will work. I'm gonna move these over so that the folks can see the screen, but three. Works out pretty good. And if you want me to just come back up here and do it for you, I'm more than happy to do it. But I moved it over kind of so everyone can see the questions. But sounds good. Okay. Well, so whenever you're ready. Okay. Maybe we'll take that one first. Yeah.
Right, we will come back together as a group. I know we all enjoy that feeling as instructors when people have such good conversations. It takes a minute to get them back together. So we've got the next 15 minutes to talk together about whatever you want to talk about. So if you want to share out from your groups, themes, insights, questions that came up in your small groups, we welcome that. Chris actually ended up having to step out. So he said, if you have questions about his project that he was presenting today, email him and he'll be glad to respond. What resources, if any, do you think WAC-WID instructors or facilitators or students might need in particular to approach questions of text recycling? Other questions or comments on this work? And I think we'll actually start off, there was a question online, Jess, so if you want to share that with us, that would be great. And do I need to give you the mic?
Okay. It's gonna project me on the Zoom, not to you guys. So the question is, what are your thoughts on the software, like Turnitin, that is becoming customizable in terms of how much match text between documents is allowed? All right.
Michael, do you want to take this or you want me to?
Well, I can take a start on it. There's a version of the text, or excuse me, of Turnitin that is often used for by a lot of professional editors and publishers, where they ask their authors either to run their text through this. What's the name of the? Authenticate. Yes, thank you. To sort of see what's flagged, and sometimes they'll even be fairly explicit and say, if it's over a certain proportion, then maybe that's a sign you should go back and rewrite and revise. But one of the things that it doesn't do quite so well is it doesn't take into account the rhetorical context in which that particular text, recycled text, appears. So there's a significant difference between whether or not a text is being recycled in something like the analysis of results section, as opposed to describing the methodology, or even in a literature review. So even though we recognize that there are a lot of publishers as well as instructors who will ask their students to perform this kind of an analysis before they turn the final draft of the paper in, we think it's also really important that there's some discussion or some information that's presented about context and situationality, and understanding that it might be more appropriate in some places of the paper as opposed to others. So we think it's sort of hard to avoid in a lot of institutions. But as with almost everything else, we want to make sure that if people are using this or these as tools, that they don't do so in a way that is meant to relieve them of the responsibility of actually looking at where this occurs and having a conversation with a student or with an author about whether or not this is a significant issue, or whether or not in context it's something that's really relatively minor. Do you want to say something?
Yeah, I'll just add that I know for Carrie Moskovitz in getting this project started, Authenticate was one of the driving factors, because that's what was driving editors to be so risk averse, or to want to have low percentages just in and of themselves. You're running a big journal, or you're part of a publisher that has a bunch of journals, and they're saying, okay, here's the percentage benchmark. And obviously these company, Turnitin, which owns both these products, has a vested interest in us like wanting to use and caring about these projects. I don't know what that noise is. So Carrie's even written actually something critical about Turnitin's public white paper on this topic.
But I think it's also important to say that when we discussed this with editors, editors often said that what they would advise authors to do is to get out of thesaurus and use synonyms and revise the syntax of the sentence so that in subsequent runs through the Authenticate system, it wouldn't be flagged. So it wasn't a matter of necessarily saying you have redundant content here. It's just a matter of saying, let's see if we can tweak the language, if we can rewrite it or revise it, or maybe use a synonym so that it will go below the threshold at which we think it needs to be considered ethical or unethical.
They're telling people to patch write their own, right? Yeah.
Joan?
Oh, it needs to run the mic out to you, so people online can hear.
I have a question about a student submitting the whole paper. I'm really fascinated by what you and others might think about the fact that instructors were concerned about learning and new learning. That was the big draw. It depended on whether there was learning that had taken place. So if I'm a student, I'm sitting in your class, you assign a paper, I go, oh, yeah, I know all this stuff. I wrote a paper on it. See, this shows that I learned it, right? And you don't know I'm recycling this paper. You give me a, decent grade on it. I'm happy with it. You're happy with it. If you found out that I had recycled it, you might, throw it out. It's self-plagiarism or whatever you want to call it. But in a sense, I'm getting punished for prior learning and prior knowledge. So how do we think about not punishing people for prior knowledge when it comes to something like text recycling? And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Thank you. I think it's a fantastic question. What I was thinking about is, as you were formulating the question, is just these different approaches that you can have to education, right? So we talked a lot about colleagues we know who have more of a credentialing mindset. Faculty on my campus in STEM, I'm at Caltech, often don't require attendance to their classes. So it's like, if you already know how to do this thing that I'm teaching you to do, you don't have to come to class and hear me talk about it. I require students to come to my class because I hopefully am designing an experience that even if they come in knowing a lot about the topic that we're talking about, they're still building on that in the course. And so I think it goes back to when you might be prohibiting the recycling of text. Have you designed an assignment that's generative for students and that's allowing them to learn something new? One of our scenarios, if you looked at it, was this came from real life, a business school where multiple faculty were assigning a resume. So if you're kind of giving students those sorts of assignments and then punishing them if they reuse text, that's bad teaching. Hopefully in a writing course, which is, I know what many of us, although certainly not all of us, teach, I think that there is something to be said for, oh, you've done something similar to this, I want you to do it again, and this time focus on X and Y instead of A and B. But so much of our work is about getting away from being punitive toward both people who are trying to publish, but also in the classroom. Michael, do you want to add to that?
I'll add just a little bit. One of the scenarios that we talked about that didn't quite make the cut here has to do with a situation that I found in one of the classes that I regularly teach, which is called Writing for Publication. And that actually happens to be a course in which part of my expectation is that students will very likely and very often be bringing work that they have done before into my class. So I would be upset if they said, okay, I wrote this short story in my 3000 level creative writing class here. Give me a grade, pass me on this course, because my goal is not so much to say, I want you to write something completely new, but I want you to take what you've already done and make it better, build on it, revise it, refine it. So the actual paper itself is not important, but it's what students do in the context of the course. So I don't see that as necessarily punishing students for doing this, but it highlights and emphasizes the fact that even if they've written a paper before, my expectation is that they're going to be doing something more with it. There's that great phrase about no great work of art is ever finished, merely abandoned. And I'm just asking them to take it out of the abandoned pile and bring it back and do something a little bit more with it.
Give another unlock.
Okay. In what ways have AI and text generators affected this project or develop it for the future?
Harry is the PI. I think his take has been, we're drawing, this grant's coming to a close, and this would be a huge new chapter to consider what generative AI means, but there are clearly a lot of resonances between both the type of work we've been doing, which is like doing empirical research and then making policies out of it, but also I think some of the specific work that we've done that's about moving past, interrogating assumptions, moving past knee-jerk reactions, and getting people to think critically about where we get the text that we incorporate into our work. Yeah, there obviously it's quite different, I think I should say, to take something you wrote before and to reuse it versus giving a prompt to a chat bot and then it generates something. So it's substantially different. Michael, do you want to jump in here and say something brilliant?
I haven't done that in however long I've been alive at this point. Yeah. apparently I don't have anything brilliant to say, so.
Oh, can I jump in because just to represent our group, because nobody's else, and I'm sorry if any of you wanna come in, but in our group, there was we were pleased to see the focus on discussion, increasing discussion, particularly around learning and process, context, coming to some agreement. But we, several of us wondered about the additional, well, I'm gonna add, this seems to be modeled on the smallish kind of writing classes and personal relationships that form learning relationships that form in writing classrooms. So if you put this in the context of middle or large size classes, which are maybe more content oriented, this places a burden on teachers and choices as to where they're going to put their instructional thought and time. Reading prior papers, entering into discussions with students, especially if, let's say, the class is somewhere between 50 and 500 or larger. Or I know if it's outsourced to TAs to make the decision. Have you thought about those kinds of issues when you get outside of the writing classroom?
Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you. So what we were thinking is that in a larger class, we'd imagine the professor coming up with a more specific policy than our suggested syllabus language. So they'd say, I ask you to write a resume. If you've written a resume in the past, feel free to start with that document and update it as little or much as you want for this class, or whatever their policy might be. So certainly in my context on my university, and I'm sure most of us have colleagues teaching much bigger classes, and I think that's where you would take care of it at the syllabus level with quite a different syllabus language policy. And maybe you're right that we should have added a couple of those onto the handouts so that that would be modeled more clearly. It could happen that if you have a writing intensive large course, yes, that TAs would be navigating it, but that's how I imagine it working, is that you would just have to make a more executive decision at a high level instead of getting into adjudicating it with each student the way we might in a smaller course. Do you want to add anything to that, Michael?
Yeah, just something.
We've got, this will be our last question.
Okay, yeah, just something relatively minor. If you take a look at the policy that we develop and that we recommend, not just for syllabus language, but for this practice in the course, one of the things that we recommend is something that we're often hearing now in response to the notion of students possibly using generative AI. And that has to do with the nature of the assignments that you give to the students, which will require them to produce some sort of original content or information that could not be directly generated by AI, or that could not be fulfilled simply by recycling a previous text from a different course. So one of the things that, as with the resume example, sometimes instructors will give assignments that are not necessarily generic, but are relatively commonplace across a variety of different courses, even in the same discipline. So we're encouraging instructors, and this might apply with the large lecture courses or classes that are taught with 250 or 300 students, to find ways to craft the assignments in a way that will make it relatively clear whether or not the student is providing some sort of initial or individual contribution or content that could not be crafted either by borrowing a text that they'd written before directly, or by turning to ChatGPT and putting in the prompt and expecting some sort of a substantive response.
We're out of time, so I just want to thank everyone for your time. Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth Bolden from MIT. I have a quick question about your taxonomy regarding the duplicate publication.
All right. Thank you, online people. Have a good one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.